Remarkable acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are gathered today. This is their land, never ceded, always sacred. And we pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the traditions, the culture and the hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. We acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the remarkable contribution they make to Australian life. And we would also like to acknowledge the advocates who have played a role in advancing the rights of people with disability, leading to address the inequalities faced by people with disability. They have paved the way for us. We carry a privilege and a responsibility because of that history. We are better together. When you think about climate change, do you think about the disability community? In the following episode, we are joined by Professor Sébastien Jodoin, Director of the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program, to talk about how his life in academia and law, combined with his experience of multiple sclerosis, has inspired his passion for researching the intersection between climate change and disability. We'll discuss why people with disabilities aren't considered in climate change justice conversations and why this needs to change as we look to the future of a truly innovative, accessible and inclusive approach to tackling climate change from both a tech and policy perspective. So lovely to have you with us today. So to start these conversations, what we like to do, because this will also be a video podcast, is invite our guests to do a visual description of themselves. So what they're wearing, what they look like, and a bit of the setting.
Sure. So I'm a white man. I have no hair. I'm just turned 40. And I am standing in my living room because it's in the evening here in Montreal. So I'm home.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, again, a big thanks for coming on the show. And to start off, I would love if you've got a pretty impressive resume and career to date, and I'm not even going to try and summarize all the things you've done. But if you wouldn't mind giving that a go and just sharing a bit about what it is that you currently do, and if you're comfortable, how exactly that's been shaped by your experience of MS.
Yeah, so I'm a law professor at McGill University in Canada. I just started my 8th year. And prior to that, I worked as a human rights lawyer and was also active in the field of climate change. So basically, my whole adult life, I've worked on human rights or climate change, and eventually human rights and climate change. So that's sort of the background that I have in that field. And I worked at the United Nations and Amnesty International and other organizations. Uh, but started working on disability and climate change a few years ago. And that was really tied to my experience of having multiple sclerosis. So I was diagnosed with MS in October 2015. It was actually just after starting my position at McGill. And I had a pretty aggressive case in terms of the onset. So I was lucky actually, because I was diagnosed right away in the emergency room in the hospital. And I remember after they gave me the diagnosis, I had, I turned to my wife, and the first thing I said was, okay, this is going to be a beautiful challenge. And I had no idea what that meant. I didn't know anything about this illness or how to manage it. But I had this idea of like knowing who I am. I was like, all right, I'm going to put everything into this. I'll end up working on healthcare or disability and whatever. So that was sort of my early sort of bounce back internal resilience in that context. Um, but then actually, a few months passed. You get adjusted, whatever. And in the summer, I realized that I was basically intolerant to heat. So 65% of people with MS will have these various symptoms when it's really hot outside. In fact, they used to diagnose people with MS by putting them in hot baths to see what trigger some of those symptoms. So basically, before MRIs, that's what they did. They used hot baths. And what it does is it triggers a number of things. Can make you more tired, it can blur your vision, and you can also feel these like tiny little electric shocks along the side of your like back of your head, along your spine. They're not like painful, but they're a sign of like your nervous system is not, functioning properly. So anyway, so I'm sort of in July in Montreal where it's very hot and humid, and you can describe it as a hot bath. And I'm like thinking to myself, okay, so this problem that I've been working on for my whole adult life, climate change, I suddenly am affected by it in a different way than others. And basically, from there, it was just much easier to start thinking about how I could bring my work to disability and climate change, given that I had never worked on healthcare, although I am now sort of in the process of realizing my other vision of starting to work on healthcare and disability. But for the most part, yeah, I ended up sort of moving my research towards the field of disability and climate change.
And I suppose when we look at climate change and we hear numbers about, slight increases and decreases to the temperature of the climate and the atmosphere, those numbers, although they're small and it might be 1 degree up, 1 degree down, what is the impact of just that 1 degree when we're talking about disability?
So we understand the way in which people with disabilities are affected by climate change as resulting from three things. So their exposure to different impacts. So if you live on the coast or if you live in an area where there'll be more sort of heat wave events or severe rainfall, uh, their sensitivity. So like what in your body might you make you more sensitive to different types of impacts. So here the connection with disability is pretty obvious. There's all sorts of impairments that people can have that will increase their risks. So I mentioned, people with MS being more affected by heat, but also people with schizophrenia are very heat intolerant, and they typically are the people who die at the highest rate, actually, in heat waves around the world. So they have actually the highest death rate per proportion of what their share of the population is, and that's because they take a medication actually that increases the makes them extremely intolerant to heat in a deadly way. And then finally, there's adaptive capacity. So that's the personal connections, the family, the community, your access to services, the assets that you have, all of the things that you need to cope with climate impacts. And here, what we can see is number one, that sort of people with disabilities face a number of barriers in society, and that diminishes their adaptive capacity. So if you're living in poverty, you might have less access to, say, air conditioning in the context of a heat wave. Um, but I think most importantly and most distressingly, what we see actually is a failure on the part of governments to have accessible responses to ensure that people with disabilities are resilient in the context of impacts of climate change. So, if I'm thinking of something in Australia that we saw were the bushfires last year, and there were reports of a lack of evacuation vehicles to move people who were wheelchair users or who had like complex medical needs, like requiring continuous medical equipment. There was nothing in place to move these people. The shelters were inaccessible. So again, it's this sort of failure to include people with disabilities that really, in these plans, is really what's going to sort of undermine their adaptive capacity. And so ultimately, it's the vulnerability of climate. Ultimately, the vulnerability of people with disabilities to climate impacts is not something that's natural. It's actually the result of failure to include them in these policies and these programs, and a broader failure to address all the barriers that they face in society.
Mm. It's it, what you speak of there is becoming so much more apparent in the wake of all of these extreme weather conditions that are going on. What feels just so much more regularly across the globe, and especially here in Australia, we've gone from bushfires to extreme floods where I am, and it is absolutely frightening. And this conversation about these accessible evacuation routes and accommodations just not being in place is huge. And I wonder, when we look at this idea of policy and government just not taking it into consideration, we can kind of reference in it was 2021 at the United Nations climate change conference when an Israeli minister, wasn't actually able to access the actual venue because it wasn't wheelchair accessible. And when we look at that one example, it is sort of this great reference point when we talk about the fact that people with disabilities aren't even given, not even a seat at the table. They're not even let in the front door when it comes to these big necessary conversations. Can you sort of speak to that and the work you're doing to try and make noise about the critical nature of including people with disabilities in all of these sort of actions towards climate change?
Yeah, so I mean, we've done research where we've collected, and I should say I work with a number of talented law students, and so we collect all of the climate policies of all the state parties to the Paris Agreement, and then we look at them to see whether they refer to people with disabilities in some way, right? I'm not talking about, we're not just looking for text that refers to the rights of persons with disabilities. We're looking for any reference to disability using other terms like chronic illness or any other term. So what we did, we did this analysis, and what we found was only 46 states mention people with disabilities in their adaptation policies. So that's less than a third. And even when we look at those references, we usually just see that people with disabilities are listed in a series of vulnerable groups. So we can't find in any of these policies concrete measures to include them in adaptation decision making, concrete measures to ensure their safety and their resilience. So at the domestic level, we're seeing basically that people with disabilities are being systematically neglected in the design of and implementation of adaptation measures. And then globally, you've referenced the fact that this Israeli minister who's a wheelchair user was unable to access the premises of the negotiations in the UK. And also within those policies, there's been a systematic neglect of people with disabilities. So basically, there's a few references here and there to people with disabilities in the multilateral climate regime, but there's been very little attention actually been paid to them. Now, the one thing that I can say is we can imagine something different. We can imagine something different because we have made strides in including women and Indigenous peoples in these processes. So there's something, for instance, called the Gender Action Plan, which is something that states under the multilateral climate regime have adopted, and it commits them to mainstreaming gender in their climate policies, and it commits them to to ensuring that women make up like a certain share of their delegations. So there's a model for how you can bring in a group that's been ignored and bring it into the process. So one thing that I find useful in talking to negotiators and policymakers and activists about disability and climate change, because it's not an issue that they are typically aware of at all, disability anyways, is actually to mention those examples. And then usually their reaction is like, oh my God, you're right. That's really strange. Or like, it's really strange that we include people with disabilities in all of these sustainable development goals, or that these are like commitments that states have made in relation to like sustainable development. There's actually quite a few that refer to people with disabilities, and there's a whole process to include them in that process. But there's nothing for climate change, and so again, the sort of discrepancy usually occurs to people when it's pointed out to them. So it's a start of a conversation about bringing a group into this process. By the way, I don't want to claim that I'm the only person trying to bring disability into the climate negotiations. There's actually a growing number of organizations of persons with disabilities and disability activists that are doing that. And I would say, actually, the research that I do, like we do this policy research, we do like share it with negotiators and policymakers and activists. But the other thing that we do that's really important is we try to provide a platform for the disability activists, entrepreneurs on the ground that are really on the front lines of climate change, and help sort of position them in the climate movement, in the climate process. So that's something we're really sort of trying to sort of co-produce, co-build a more inclusive process.
That's brilliant. And when you speak about these sort of entrepreneurs on the ground, what are some of the exciting things coming out of this space that disability advocates are driving?
So on the flip side of this, when we're looking at efforts to actually reduce carbon emissions and make our societies more sustainable, there's a lot of experience and know-how in the disability community about how to do this in an accessible way. So I actually always like to say that the disability activists that have been pushing for like transit systems to be accessible are climate activists. They perhaps sometimes don't think of themselves this way.
We already were
But I
used
think if
to
you're trying
doing
to make it
things,
easier for
part
people to say they
time
use the
remotely
transit
or whatever.
system,
So I
making
think
it,
actually,
you're making it
what
possible
I would love
reduce our
for
reliance
governments
on
and also companies
on
that
fossil
design
fuel,
products like
on cars that run on
leisure
fossil fuels.
wear companies,
So
athletic companies, like
there's
these
lots of
companies should be
lawsuits
figuring
that
out
have been
how will
launched
people
all over
exercise
the world by
in the future
disability
when it's really
activists
hot.
trying
And the
to
people they should turn
force,
to are people with disabilities. Like
transit
we're the
systems
ones who
to be
right now
more
are
accessible.
like facing
And
the
here
most
we can see
severe
again that
impacts
when we're
of this
designing these
crisis.
systems in an accessible
And
way,
we're coming up with
it not
solutions
only
because we're not
benefits
just,
wheelchair users, it
going to
benefits
stop
a whole
going outside. I
huge
just
group of
don't
users,
think
right?
that's the
So
sort
if
of
you are
approach that most people I know
if you are, for instance,
have.
installing,
Instead, we're just constantly
elevators
trying to
in
find
your subway
tips, tricks,
system,
strategies
this will
to and
benefit
innovating
the
and
elderly,
developing
which
solutions.
are a growing
At the end of
share
these
the population
conversations,
in
I
the
like to
West.
invite all of the
It
guests
will
to
benefit
share an
people who
insight
maybe
and
are
a
limited in
remarkable
that.
insight to be a bit
It will make
punny.
it way easier
I
for
mean,
parents
I
with
guess
strollers
I'll
to use
say,
that system. Right?
well,
So
okay.
anytime that you're
I'm
making
relatively new to the disability
more
world,
accessible for
and I've had the good fortune
group
of
based perhaps
meeting
on their
a number of
impairments and
experienced
their
disability
experience with
activists.
disability, you're actually
And
also
one of
creating all
those
sorts of
people
opportunities
is
for
a
other
colleague who
users
helped
to
me sort of
benefit
start the
from
program.
those designs.
I remember her name is Yolanda Munoz, and she's been
electric cars
involved in the disability rights movement for
don't make
decades.
any noise.
And I remember
when
saying,
they
she
are
said something
operating
to me
at
early
full
on
speed.
when we were working on this
And
project.
actually, it was blind
She said,
activists from the National
Sebastian,
Foundation
they're
for the
not
Blind
going to
in the United
invite
States
us to
that
the table.
realized, really
Like, we're
early
just going to
on,
have to
oh my
show
God,
up
this
and
is
ask for a
huge
place
danger
at the
for us.
table.
And so
I realized,
the US
that's always been the
Congress
case, right?
require
The
car
very
manufacturers
foundations of the
to
disability
include,
rights movement
sound
were
when
people
those
showing
vehicles
up
run
and
at a low
asking
speed.
for
So
their
again,
rights
this is not
and
just
asking
going
for
to
changes to
save the
infrastructures and
lives
policies and
of
programs.
people who are visually
So I
impaired.
think
It's going to save
really,
the lives of
as
so
much
many
as
other
I
people, right? The people
think
crossing
that the
street,
climate movement and
children,
climate
the person
policymakers
not paying
haven't
attention.
sort of
So,
thought through
and in
how
a
they could be more
way, what I
accessible
find kind of
to
interesting
people with
about it is
disabilities,
that,
I think honestly, those
here
of
in
us
Montreal,
who
and
have
I hope
disabilities,
all over the
like
world
we also just need
eventually,
to show
we will
up
start to
because
hear
they're not
the
going to
different
just randomly
sounds that these
invite
electric
us.
cars make
They're not just going to
instead of
randomly have
the
insights
motors.
about,
And so
oh yeah, we
basically,
should make
the
this
soundscape
accessible.
of a
We're going to
city
have to
will
ask
have been
for that.
transformed
And so yeah,
by the
that's, I guess my
realization
insight is
that someone had
basically
that
that we're going to have to
basically
show up.
actually you can't have sound
They're not
vehicles.
going to
That's
invite us to the
dangerous.
table.
The full interview with our guest can be found in the link below where you press play on this podcast, our show notes. Make sure you subscribe or hit follow to not miss another remarkable Insights episode. You're just, when you give someone the opportunity to explain something in a very simple term, it is such an obvious realization that you go, wow, okay, that seems like such a, something that we should have taken into account. And it's just giving people that platform to share those stories, which is what it sounds like the work you're doing with your research. And I'll reference the Disability Inclusive Climate Action Research Program, which you founded or you're founding director of. I'd love you to speak to the work you're doing there as a collective to drive this message wider.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we are working collaboratively with organizations of persons with disabilities internationally and in different parts of the world to generate, co-produce, and translate knowledge around disability and climate change. So I want to say about co-producing, the importance is that we basically are working with a diverse group of people with disabilities to make sure that our research actually is aligned with their priorities. So again, this is just, connects with inclusive design practices, right? So making sure that the end users of the research are involved and that it's accessible to them. And then when I say translate, what I really mean is, of course, I end up publishing journal articles that maybe hopefully scholars and graduate students will read. But really, we need to translate those findings to speak to a different audience. So really transforming the text to make sure that it's accessible to people with disabilities, but also that it speaks to and is persuasive to policymakers, to journalists, can be used by activists. So that's really the collaborative endeavor to sort of figure out like what do we not know, and then figure out ways to answer important questions, but also then find ways to ensure that that knowledge is useful, that it has that impact on the world. So, and unfortunately, there's a lot that we don't know about the intersections of disability and climate change. So we have the the burden of actually trying to address some of those gaps. So we are doing the first empirical study on the climate resilience of people with disabilities in a region of India, and looking at sort of how climate change there affects people with disabilities, but also like what tools, what strategies have they developed to be resilient? What lessons can we learn? And I have to tell you, one of the reasons we chose India actually was that they have done a better job of protecting people in heat waves than many Western countries have. And so, like, one of the questions that like, they had these heat waves that were quite deadly many years ago, and more recently, honestly, they've had fewer deaths from heat waves in India than we've had in Canada. So why? So we have a few hypotheses, but that's why we're doing the research, right? And also, actually, here in my hometown, as Montreal is sort of trying to address its largest share of carbon emissions, so in the transportation sector, there's all these things happening, right? So introducing rapid bike lanes, electrifying vehicles, car sharing programs, of course, expanding like also bike sharing programs and expanding the transit system, and building new green spaces. And this is a thing that we're recently doing, is trying to figure out, okay, well, how many of these solutions are accessible? Like, how many of these solutions are perhaps even creating new barriers for people with disabilities? So we just don't know, and that's why we're doing this research. But one of the things that we've learned, for instance, is that these, rapid bike lanes, which again, I'm a cyclist, I love, but they have not been designed in ways to think about, like, how does a blind person cross the street if the if this like rapid bike lane is like designed for the bikes to basically never stop. So again, it's sort of, no one thought about that barrier, and no one thought about how you could design it in an inclusive way. And I like to say that not only well, this is again, it's an example of sort of an exclusionary practice, but I like to say that disability inclusive design is just good design, right? It's just figuring out, like, how do I build something that's going to benefit as many people as possible. And so once again, unfortunately, we see that doesn't seem to have been uh, the case in many of these sort of new programs that actually I think we're seeing all over the world. Also, like, another one is reducing, like, there's this idea of like streets that are like shared between cars, bikes, and people, which is again amazing. But what they do is they lower the sidewalk, or they get rid of the sidewalk. I don't know if you've seen this in Australia, but we're seeing this pretty much all over the world. Well, again, if you were blind and you relied on the sidewalk to move, to know, where you are and where you are in relation to others, this is a huge problem. So the thinking here is not necessarily that those policies need to be abandoned. It's more like, okay, so if this is going to work, how do we make it work for all users? What kind of changes do we need to make? And making sure that we do that upfront, not once we've implemented the measure and then the barriers are there. So again, this is the start of a conversation that I know will take many many years to bear fruit. But it's important that we get the data and get that lived experience, and then bring it to those policymakers and tell them, hey, this is rapid bike lanes, lowered sidewalks, great ideas, but you didn't think about this, and what should we do about that?
And when you talk about going to these policymakers with this hard evidence, with the work you've already done, are you seeing the urgent response that you are hoping for from the people that can make this change?
So I think that my conversations, first of all, I guess I should say I speak to both policymakers, but also climate activists, right? So there is a lot of ableism in the climate movement itself, which, I guess that reflects ableism in society. I think it also reflects a number of things about the people who are climate activists. And I have to say, I understand, because honestly, before I had MS, it never occurred to me that linkages between disability and climate change. It never occurred to me that, a 2-3 hour demonstration walking through the streets of a city might not be accessible to a whole bunch of people. I was one of those people who would ride their bike to work, and I would look at the people driving and think, my God, these people are misguided, and they're just part of the problem. And then my first year with MS, actually, I had difficulty walking, so I had to drive to work, and that experience actually was, transformative for me, because I was kind of thinking like, okay, so like I need a car to get around right now, and I had to come to terms with that. But then I kind of, it brought me to a space of empathy, to basically be like, okay, so maybe these other people, like what do I know about these people's lives? What structures, what pressures they're facing, what impairments they have, so it actually brought me into a place of empathy, and which I then later discovered is like really important in the literature on inclusive design as well. So like trying to understand how people use something and why, and putting yourself in their shoes. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in the climate movement around sort of, the people who are the typical climate people, climate activists. There are still a lot of things that they don't know about disability, even though there's more and more sort of disabled people who are climate activists as well.
Well, just to interject, they kind of call, I've come across this term called eco-ableism,
Yes.
and I suppose that's exactly what you're speaking to.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, there's lots of examples of that, but I think not to focus on just one example, but I think the way that we promote sort of cycling, or the idea of like you're going to, I don't know, buy all your food at the local market and cook with only fresh ingredients. Like there's a lot of those behaviors that are actually not accessible to people with disabilities, for a number of reasons.
It's interesting. In Australia, it may have been 2 or 3 years ago, there was there were a few policies put in place about plastic straws, and it sparked a really big conversation about the fact that a plastic straw is something that is a lifeline for many people with disabilities, and it's something that needs a wider conversation about. There are absolutely things we can all do to minimize our impacts on climate change, but we need to do this with a diverse and inclusive conversation, because by eliminating the use of plastic straws, we are also it is wildly detrimental to the health and safety of so many people.
Yeah, the straw bans that we saw spread all over the world are a great example of this. And, again, it just reflects this idea of, okay, plastic straws are a problem, let's ban them. But you didn't consult anybody who might, whose lives and ability to drink or eat food depends on these products. So you really, it's sort of failure to be inclusive in sort of consulting and listening to a diversity of people. So what I give this example all the time in these presentations, and I sort of am saying, look, let's avoid that kind of problem. Let's bring people with disabilities to the table at the very beginning, because actually it might be the case that some people will always require plastic straws. It might also be the case that there are alternatives that could be developed for some people, and that those, of course, will need to be co-designed with them. So again, it sort of goes back to the importance of good design, figuring out how you produce something that doesn't make the lives of people worse, and in fact helps them lead full and full lives. So um,
So you speak about this idea of needing to have this conversation with activists, and then when it comes to those that are actually making these policies, speaking to government, how does that unfold?
so I would say, so I've been doing this for like 3 years now. The first conversations I had, like I remember going to the climate negotiations in Madrid in 2019, just before the pandemic hit, actually. And I remember, I presented on disability and climate change. I met with people, told them I was working on this, and the reaction was like, "Huh? What? Like, what do you mean? Like, I don't understand." So there's just a lot. I would say that's we're in a better place now, but early on it was just like puzzle. People were puzzled, like they didn't understand what I was talking about. Like they couldn't think of the linkages, which again, I don't blame them because it didn't occur to me before I got MS. So I like to support this out. Like I'm not, clever or smart. I just happen to be a climate change specialist who got a disability. And so, I don't blame people for not knowing or not figuring out this connection. So sometimes I get pushback around the costs or like the burden of including yet another group, right? So the climate policymakers have been sort of asked to bring in women, to be responsive to Indigenous peoples. And sort of then there's just like, okay, so this is yet another group that we have to include. How can we do all of this at once? And also, picking people with disabilities, making things accessible, that costs money. So I have had a little bit of pushback. And over time, I've devised sort of a response to that, which I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but it's actually a point about inclusive design, which is that, I think that if you're approaching these things as an activist, you might rightly demand, full inclusion, perfect accessibility right away. But if you're thinking about this from a design perspective, you kind of accept that mistakes will happen. You kind of accept that it's sort of what's most important is to consult and co-build and have sort of iterations and continuously improve. And you won't get things perfect right away. And so that's kind of, I find at least that removes some of the anxiety that people have. So it's funny because I'm running off on two tracks. On the one hand, I'm a lawyer who's basically saying to states, you are not fulfilling your obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It turns out that kind of argument actually will get people's attention, including the media. So that's useful. That's a useful hook to sort of get started around these conversations. But then concretely, when people are thinking what are we going to do next? Actually, it's helpful to be sort of thinking about these things from the perspective of you're not going to get it done right away. It's more of a process right now because we're all sort of figuring this out as we go along, right? I have the same experience with our events that we do as a research program for the last 2 years. Every single time that we do an event, we figure out some new accessibility feature that we could implement. Someone gives us the comment. And I think it's really helpful to have, what's called tolerance for error. Like you accept that you're not defensive about it. You're just like, oh yeah, we didn't do that. We didn't get that right. So the next time we'll do better. So I'm seeing some of that discourse. And I should say last week, very exciting. I had this very exciting opportunity to address the G7 ministers of disability. So I was invited by the government of Germany to basically brief the ministers for Japan, Canada, Germany, all the other G7 countries on disability inclusive climate action. So I don't the response at that meeting was very positive. Whether it will lead to concrete measures, it still remains to be seen. So to be continued. Yeah.
Congratulations. That sounds like a brilliant opportunity.
Yeah, well, it was definitely a different experience of speaking to people at that level. So, yeah.
I work in the disability tech space, and so I'm constantly surrounded by this excited energy. But I also know that when I step out of my work bubble and I chat with people that aren't working in this space, they're kind of like, wow, that's great. What a niche. I never knew that existed. And I go, well, your phone exists, your laptop exists, the internet exists. And that started from this really cool place of, you know, people with lived experience of disability innovating and designing and creating solutions that are part of everybody's day-to-day life, which is what you talk about when you say inclusive design is better for everyone. Um, if we're thinking big and bold here, when we look to the future of climate change and how that really involves people with disabilities, what do you know, as someone with MS, what are some of the things that you think technology could help with if we're dreaming big?
Okay, well, if you don't mind, I'll start with a story actually, which is that I started by saying that I ended up working on disability climate change because I realized I was intolerant to heat. But the story doesn't end there. Basically, what happened after that was I started thinking, okay, what can I do about this? Because I'm not, I had read this book of someone who had MS, and they said, yeah, in the summer I stay inside. And that wasn't something that was acceptable to me, especially with, having a small kid and loving to be outdoors. So I kind of started thinking, surely someone has solved the problem of how you stay cool in the summer when it's hot. And actually, my first thought was mascots in at Disney World in Florida. Okay, my thought was these people are in super hot costumes in July in Orlando. What do they do? So I started like researching basically the niche world of people who are mascots, and I discovered that they wear these cooling vests. So, and then I eventually like sourced basically this cooling vest for myself. So it's basically it's a vest, and you put inside these like this like sort of liquid that freezes at 4 degrees Celsius. Okay, and what's cool about that is, well, cool. Sorry for the pun, but it keeps your body cool for 3 hours. So I was sort of, walking around in July and August in those periods of time wearing these cooling vests. They were like my assistive device, if you will, and I was perfectly fine. And as I was sort of doing this, and people would be like, "What is that?" And like menopausal women, we were like, "Oh my god, like I need that." And it occurred to me actually that if possibly everyone will need these vests if we have, if our summers are averaging 40 degrees and we don't, right now the advice is stay home, being in air conditioning, drink water or whatever. But I'm guessing that people are going to still want to be outside. And so we're going to have to adapt and design innovative solutions. So my little story about the ice vest is sort of building on that. I think in a way, the people who are most affected now by climate change, the people with disabilities, like we are already sort of constantly in our lives having to come up with solutions, right? Having to innovate. I like to think that people with disabilities are masters in resilience, right? Like we have to navigate a world that's not been designed for us and find all of these tips and these tricks and these things to get through life and be happy and be employed and all these things. And I think sometimes it's interesting, like the pandemic, teleworking, all the people that I knew who had disabilities who were like completely used to working from home. Really, like there was not much of an adjustment for us. We already were used to doing things, part time remotely or whatever. So I think actually what I would love is to start a dialogue I would love for governments and also companies that design products that are meant to also work at some point in the future, in a future that's a little bit hotter than ours. So I'm thinking, like, athlete, leisure wear companies, athletic companies, like these companies should be figuring out how will people exercise in the future when it's really hot. And the people they should turn to are people with disabilities. Like we're the ones who right now are like facing the most severe impacts of this crisis, and we're coming up with solutions because we're not just going to stop going outside. I just don't think that's the sort of approach that most people I know have. Instead, we're just constantly trying to find tips, tricks, strategies and innovating and developing solutions. So I'm seeing a lot of that, these kind of initiatives around the world. In the UK, an initiative where they work to sort of help design accessible bikes for all sorts of users, bodies, people of different abilities. So I love that idea. I love the idea of like basically democratizing cycling itself and making it possible again for people with disabilities who want to exercise and be active. We need to find solutions, and actually they need to find those solutions for themselves. Yeah, I think that's what, I guess, if I'm thinking big, I'm thinking about people with disabilities being sort of recognized as knowers, makers, and doers, both in resilience and in accessibility, and that leading to all sorts of really cool innovations.
I think you probably will have an endless list when I ask this question. But if people want to, follow some politicians and some climate activists that are really doing some great work in this space, do you have anyone that comes to mind that we should let our listeners know of?
Well, I mean, in your part of the world, the Pacific Disability Forum has actually been the first and leading organization of persons with disabilities that's been working on climate change. So I think they've been huge leaders in this space. And there's been sort of increasing advocacy on the part of disability rights groups in Australia, actually, just this past year. So I think actually that, these organizations are sort of they've already been working on different aspects of climate change without necessarily explicitly working on climate change, but now they're confronting this issue head on. So I think those are, forgive me, there's a case also that's been launched in Australia on behalf of Indigenous youth and people with disabilities that's also trying to hold Australia accountable for its lack of action in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So that's I would say there's actually lots of things happening in Australia in this area. So that's exciting. But one of the best things about setting up this research program has been that I've been contacted by groups all over the world who are sort of just starting to work on these things. And so I could give you lots and lots of examples, but I'll give you just one that I find really cool that came out earlier this week. It's this disability group in Bristol in the UK. They've come up with a guide to how you organize sort of climate activism and demonstrations in an accessible way. It's the first guide that I'm aware of that addresses this issue, and I think it's great because, again, it's sort of like trying to get at all the different ways in which the climate movement itself might not be as inclusive and might not be as accessible as it should.
At the end of these conversations, I like to invite all of the guests to share an insight, and a remarkable insight, to be a bit punny, cheesy. But that could be a piece of advice, it could be a fact, it could be something that, some sort of insight into the space you're working with that you want to leave people with as a bit of a thought-provoking moment. I'll invite you now to share one insight you'd like to leave people with.
Here's what I'll say. I'm relatively new to the disability world, and I've had the good fortune of meeting a number of experienced disability activists. And one of those people is a colleague who helped me sort of start the program. And I remember her name is Yolanda Munoz, and she's been involved in the disability rights movement for decades. And I remember she said something to me early on when we were working on this project. She said, Sébastien, they're not going to invite us to the table. Like, we're just going to have to show up and ask for a place at the table. And I realized, yeah, that's always been the case, right? The very foundations of the disability rights movement were people showing up and asking for their rights and asking for changes to infrastructures and policies and programs. So I think really, as much as I think that the climate movement and climate policymakers haven't sort of thought through how they could be more accessible to people with disabilities. I think, honestly, those of us who have disabilities, like, we also just need to show up, because they're not going to just randomly invite us. They're not just going to randomly have insights about, oh, yeah, we should make this accessible. We're going to have to ask for that. And so, yeah, that's, I guess my insight is basically that we're going to have to show up. They're not going to invite us to the table.